morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Today we are painting this beautiful sunset on a lake. To start off with, I have my sketchbook. I'll put the name up on the screen. It's 100% cotton watercolor paper sketchbook. It's cold pressed. And what I'm doing here is I'm taping down all along the edges for a nice clean white line. It's not necessary, but it's also helpful because I'm going to be using a lot of water so that the pages underneath it don't kind of get splashed by all the water that I'm using for this. Then I have my little jar of water. It's just a recycled jar from my kitchen. And then for the colors, we'll be using a little ultramarine blue, a quinacridone violet, cadmium yellow light, cobalt blue, cadmium orange, and then the magenta rose. We're now ready to draw in the horizon line. For this horizon line, we're putting it in the center of the page, one line on top of another with a little space in between. That way we will know to, or remember to keep that little line the white of the paper so we won't be going over it until later. And to start off with, I'm using a number 2 quill brush and using just water, painting the top above that first horizon line, coming all the way down to the horizon line. So you can see that the paper is glistening wet, very, very wet. The quill brushes, they hold on to a lot of water, so it's perfect for this. And then going towards the bottom half of the paper and keeping that little line in between the two horizon lines dry so that it will stay paper white, and filling in the area on the top and the bottom with water. I then dry off the quill brush a bit on the paper towel, and I'm sopping up just a little bit of that water on the line of the tape. Next, we're going to go right into the cadmium yellow light. The brush has a lot of water on it, so I don't need to make a puddle of yellow. I'm just putting it right into the already wet page or paper. And I'm making sure to stop that color right on that pencil line and leaving that space in between the top half and the bottom half dry so that it will remain white. And then brush off some of the paint from my brush onto the paper towel. And this helps to bring out that wash smoothly so that it is going from a little bit thicker to thinner, and it is going towards the water, and then you can manipulate that yellow, move it around a bit. You just want to go for a soft, subtle blend from the yellow into the white at the top of the page. I will go back over it in a little bit. As you can see, the bottom half, I put more paint on my brush than I did for the top half. And so I will go back in and make them so that they are equal in value, as I don't want the top half being so much lighter than the bottom half. So I am gently bringing that yellow down and then rinsing it off of my brush and dabbing my brush on the paper towel. So the brush is still damp, but it's not sopping wet. And then going into that yellow and bringing it down towards the bottom of the page so that it is becoming lighter and lighter as I go down. And then going back into that yellow right at the line, the horizon line, and then bringing it down a bit more. So this way we have a soft gradient as it goes towards the white at the bottom of the paper. And I want to make sure to leave a bit of that white between the blue and the yellow, especially in the sky. So that's why I don't go all the way to the top, or you'll make a green later on. So here I am adding in some more of that cadmium yellow light, as the sky was going to be a bit too light compared to the water if I left it as it was. And while I could have taken back up some of that yellow paint from the water, I did like that bright look, so I decided to make the sky brighter to match the water, instead of taking some of the yellow from the water to match the sky. But you can do it either way, just make sure that they're matching each other in value and brightness. And then we are ready to move on with the blue for the sky. Out of the brush, and I'm re-wetting the very top of the paper, as it was still damp, but it wasn't quite as wet as I wanted it to be. If yours is still very wet, just leave it. And I'm bringing that water all the way down into the yellow, as I touched the yellow a little bit, and I don't want to have water drawing lines or any kind of, funny lines in the sky. I want it to be pretty smooth. So I'm washing out my brush again, as I had gone back into the yellow, and I'm going into the cobalt blue, and starting at the top, I'm adding in that blue and very gently taking that blue down towards the yellow, but making sure to leave a bit of white area in between the blue and the yellow, as I don't want to have green in the sky. Adding in just a little bit more cobalt blue, and then rinsing that blue off of my brush, dabbing it on the paper towel, dabbing it some more so that the brush is damp but it's not as wet as the paper. And I'm picking up some of that blue, especially towards the white part of the painting, so that it is a subtle change from a little bit darker blue at the top of the paper down to where it fades out completely when it hits the white area. And then for the bottom, for the water, I am adding some more just clear water again, as it has dried just a little bit, where it's still damp, but it's not quite as wet as I want it to be. And then I'm going in with the same cobalt blue. And for the water, it can be a little bit green. It's not as important to stay out of the yellow, so you can go over the yellow just a little bit. And I go right into that white area, with the blue just a little bit, all the way up into the yellow area, and I'm making horizontal lines as I paint to give it that look of water. And then I'm adding a little bit more blue straight from the pan to give it the look of water, where it's a little bit dark in areas and a little bit light. Definitely adding a lot more texture to it than I had with the sky. I'm rinsing out my brush so that I can go into the cadmium orange, and I will be making a wash of cadmium orange, just a little puddle here right on the plate. The consistency is pretty thin. I want it to be like a glazing of orange. So I'd say it's about tea consistency. I should have tried it out on a little scrap piece of paper. I tried it out right on the painting, realized I wanted it to be a bit more orange, added a little more in. And with the number 2 quill brush, it holds a lot of water, a lot of paint, so I'm able to get 2 long brush strokes in. And then I'm dabbing off some of that paint and water onto the paper towel, a little bit more for each of the 2 long brush strokes that came next. So it's getting thinner and thinner the farther I go up towards the top of the sky. As I go down towards the bottom of the page, I brush off some of that water and paint on the paper towel with each stroke. And that way it gets lighter and lighter the farther I go down towards the bottom of the page. Then I'm rinsing off a little bit of that paint that's on the brush. I dab it on the paper towel again so that it's an even lighter wash as I get closer to the blue on the water. I'm using some very light horizontal strokes to give it that look of water. And then using my hair dryer, I want to make sure it is very, very dry before going on to the next step. So for this next step, we're going to be using black. The black that I have with this Rosa Gallery Botanical 28 colors. It's called Black Grape, but any black will do. And we're starting with a wet brush right into the pan of black color and dabbing it onto the paper, making a hill that has trees on it. So we're not going into any detail of the tree, just making little kind of dabs towards the top to give it that texture as if it's the tree line on a hill out in the distance, but not making any little tiny details really, just giving you the feeling of trees in the distance. And then I'm going to about halfway with each hill, so the hills start a little bit taller and then they meet kind of in the center of the paper and they're a little bit shorter. So it gives you that feeling of looking out into the distance where the hills are a little bit closer on the sides of the painting and go out into the distance in the center. Once you're happy with how your hills with the trees look, you can start on the reflections. Sometimes when the water is moving more, the reflections are choppier. It just depends how still the water is. For this painting, I'm making them pretty still and just a little bit of movement. But to show that, I'm painting them in so that they're pretty much the mirror image. It's not perfect, I'm just winging it, but you can draw it in with a pencil first so that you might feel more comfortable with drawing the mirror image of what you have already painted in. Mine are not perfect by any means. I'm just winging it here, but you can draw it in if you want to make it as perfect as you want, or just do it like I am and kind of wing it, making it a bit thinner towards the center, just like on the top half, and then wider and wider as you go towards the side, and creating a similar top to the tree line, but not exact. And then I'm going back in with a little more of that black grape. And as you can see, I have painted just a little bit here and there into that white line that separates the trees and the hills from the top half to the bottom half, the reflection. As when you're looking at a sunset with the line of the land where it hits the water, you see a little bit of that brightness, but it's not an exact strip that goes all the way along. There are just kind of pops of that brightness, and you get the feeling of that line, but it doesn't keep just a complete white straight line across. You want to make sure to go into it a little bit here and there to make it look a bit more realistic. So now we are making a puddle of the magenta rose mixed with the quinacridone violet, and this will be for the clouds. The painting is very dry. You want to make sure it is bone dry so that the clouds do not blend in with the yellow or the blue. And then you'll want to test it to make sure it is a very, very light value. Before starting on the clouds, I decided to put in the sun. So I'm using a size 2. You can use a size 0 little round brush. And with just water on it, I'm painting a tiny little circle and then picking up the paint with a paper towel. I'm not sure how easy it will be for you to pick back up the color. So if you would like to, you can just use a bit of white gouache to paint it in. You don't need to try to pick up the color. I don't want you to mess up your horizon line. If you have worked really hard on those trees, I don't want you to worry about picking back up any of the color in the area. You can just paint it in with the white gouache, which I am also going to do in just a minute. And then I'm also going into the reflection and painting an upside down triangle pretty much of reflected lighter sunlight. And so I'm going all the way from that line of the horizon line and then down about, I'd say maybe a couple inches into the yellow of the reflected sunset. And I'm picking it back up with a paper towel. Don't be afraid to do that at any time, where if you don't like what you've put down, if it's too dark, if it's in the wrong place, you could try to re-wet it and pick it back up with a paper towel or a cloth. In this case, that black grape that I've used is very, very difficult to pick back up all the way, which it actually is working to my advantage in this painting, as I don't want to pick it up completely, but I do want it to be a lighter shade of what I've put down. I decide it's not quite bright enough, and also to show you another way of doing the same thing, I will be going in with a little bit of white gouache. Now, gouache is similar to watercolor, but it is more opaque, and so when you paint it on top, if you don't like it, you can remove it with just getting it wet again and picking it back up with your paper towel. So if you want to try it and it doesn't work out, you can remove it very carefully. But what I'm doing is I'm painting over that little circle of a sun with that white gouache straight from the tube. I'm not adding any water to it, but you can add water to it to make it a little bit easier to use, which I do end up doing. It's a pretty old gouache, so it's maybe a little bit clumpy, but I'm adding a little bit of water to it and making it a little bit thinner consistency so that it is easier to paint with this brush. And this brush is I believe it's a number 2 round brush. You can use a number 0 round brush, any little round brush that you feel comfortable with. And once I get it to be as bright as I'm happy with, I go back to that number 2 quill brush and go into that little puddle of quinacridone violet and a magenta rose, and I'm starting to paint in the clouds. For these clouds, I'm wanting them to kind of swoop upwards, an arc towards the top of the sky, so it gives the sky a little bit of movement. As a reference, I'm using a photo that I took a long time ago of just a really pretty sunset, and I'm changing the clouds a bit to better fit this painting, but I'm using just very light, small strokes and kind of clumping those small strokes together so that they're touching and they're making the larger shapes of the clouds. And here and there, I'm adding just little tiny clouds and then going in and making larger clouds, especially as I near the top of the painting. I want the clouds to be just a little bit bigger as they get towards the top, so that you have the feeling of them coming towards you as they get towards the top of the painting. and of them going far into the distance as they near the center of the painting. So the clouds in the center of the painting are smaller, and then they get bigger and bigger, larger and larger as they near the top of the painting. For the reflection of the clouds, I am not doing it perfectly. I don't think it's that important to get it exact, especially when you're just having fun in a sketchbook. But if you do want it to be exact, you can trace the clouds on the top half of the painting and then transfer that tracing you've done of your clouds to the bottom half, and that way you can have them exact if that's important to you. In some paintings, I do that for the landscape when there's a reflection on water, and it's whatever you're feeling like. I was just kind of winging it, going with not exactly how they look as a reflection, but just the general smaller clouds swooping out from the sun towards the bottom, and then getting bigger towards the top, and trying to keep them not exactly the same size and shape, but similar sizes and shapes as the top half in the reflection. Also not worrying too much about it, as in the painting it does look like there's a little bit of movement in the water down below as you get towards the bottom of the page. So when the water is moving, the reflections look a little bit different. It's not a completely still area of water, so it won't be reflecting like a mirror image. With that same very thin wash, I'm adding in a few more strokes here and there just to make it better reflect what's on top and to give it kind of a feeling of water with a little bit of movement in it. As I have made many strokes with this brush without going back into the puddle, the amount of paint and water in the brush is reduced a bit, so you can see the color is softer and lighter the more I paint, which works out well for this part of it. The clouds have dried to a beautiful pale violet, but I want to make the clouds towards the top and the bottom of the painting just a little bit darker to give you a more realistic look, to make you feel like you are standing right there in the painting so that the clouds at the top and the bottom, I'll be adding just a little bit more of that quinacridone violet mixed with the magenta rose, and I'm adding it in kind of long horizontal lines to the bottom to give it that look of water, but in the same areas where the clouds are on the top of the painting. I rinsed out my brush just a little bit and dabbed it on the paper towel so that there's just a tiny bit of the paint left on the brush, mostly just water, and I'm adding more of those horizontal back and forth strokes to give it even more of that semi-still but not perfectly still water effect. And these strokes are getting lighter and lighter as I go towards the horizon line. In my imagination, the water has a little bit more movement as it is closer to you, and it is more still the farther away towards the horizon line. The clouds at the top are now dry, so to add in that darker value of violet, I'm putting it into the already painted shapes of clouds that I have down just towards the top of the painting. And I'm making sure to stay in those shapes that I've already painted, but if you go out of the shapes of your clouds, that's okay too. It'll add just a little more texture to your clouds. So now I am wiping the brush off so that it is just barely damp, or it's damp, it's not wet. And I'm bringing that color down into the rest of the cloud, not the whole cloud, but just a bit of a way down. So that way it goes from that darker area and kind of gently fades into the lighter cloud area. And by taking most of the water off of the brush, by maybe not most of the water, but by making the brush drier than the paper and gently moving it down from the color wet part into the dry part of the cloud, you're able to make a much more subtle fade than if you were to just paint on the wet onto the dry. You would have a more severe drying line. So then I dry the painting completely with a hairdryer, and I'm adding in just a little bit of very watered down cobalt blue into the yellow part of the painting on the water, so that it gives you just a little more of that watery feel. I'm just doing the back and forth lines, and it is a very, very light wash and barely there, so feel free to skip that part. Then after I am happy with how I have the water, and after it is completely dry, I am using a number 6 round brush to make these grasses or reeds. And I'm using that same black grape. And the puddle of black grape that I made, it's a little bit thicker than tea consistency because you don't want it to be see-through completely. You don't want it to be a transparent glaze. You want it to be more of a thicker layer so that you can't see exactly everything behind it. You want it to look like the sun is behind the reeds, and so it creates more of a silhouette of the grasses or reeds that you're painting. If you would like to draw these in first, that will work as well. You can draw them in with pencil and then go over your lines with the paintbrush. I'm now adding in a little bit more of that black grape to make it look like there is a bit of land, or that the reeds and grasses are a bit thicker in this area. And then pulling from that dark kind of blob area up into the reeds so that it looks like there is a smooth transition from that area, kind of the land area, up into the reeds. You can put as many or as few reeds or grasses as you would like. This is just from my imagination and looking at photos online, kind of a combination. So you can do whatever you would like to do here. I had an art teacher in elementary school that used to say you can use your artist license, and she had us make our own artist license with our picture and name. And I just thought that was so fun as an elementary school student. So now as an adult, I just have to remind myself I don't have to follow a painting or instructions exactly. I can just use my artist license. So feel free to use yours. Once you're happy with your reeds or grasses, we'll be using that same number 2 round brush. So you'll wash it off really well, and then we'll be using that cadmium yellow light. While the black is still wet, we are just dropping the very tip of the paintbrush into that black area, And it creates, when it dries, kind of like little glowy starbursts. And to my mind, it makes it look like there are maybe fireflies or just a beautiful glow from the sunset. It looks a bit of a stark contrast at first, but as it dries, it lightens up. And so it's more of just a really pretty texture and more of a subtle, kind of glowy, magical effect. I add a few here and there up the reeds themselves as well. And then once you're happy with the amount of glow that you've added to the reeds or grasses, we are going to be adding on at the very top a little bloom of the reed or grass. And to do this, I'm using that same number 2 brush. You could use a number 0 round brush, whatever brush you're comfortable with for very small details. And at first I'm drawing a kind of like a just a curved line down, and then adding a few little squiggly lines that are almost attached to it. And this gives me the kind of backbone of the little blossom or bloom. And I fill it in very gently, trying to be as delicate as possible. But you can just skip this part altogether. It looks beautiful without it. Or you can hand draw it in with a pencil at first and then go over it with a paintbrush. It's just up to you if you want to give this a try. Remember that the black grape is very difficult to pick back up completely. So if you do want to give this a try, it will be kind of permanent. You won't be able to pick it back up with a paper towel, unfortunately. So maybe practice this on another piece of paper, watercolor paper, a few times before adding it into your painting if you do want to go for it. And then adding in just a little bit more to make sure that it is the shape that I'm happy with, and it's just making it a little bit darker in value. I decide to add a few more little grasses or reeds down below. I probably should have stopped where I had it previously, but sometimes I have a hard time knowing when to stop. And then I added in just a few more little dots of that yellow after cleaning off the brush. Once the painting has completely dried, you can use a hairdryer or wait for about 10 minutes. I very carefully removed the tape, and you can see up at the right hand corner a little bit of the blue did seep underneath the tape. I did not press firmly enough on the tape when I put it on in the beginning. So I'll show you how I deal with that. The first thing that I try to do is using a damp brush or wet brush, gently rub the paint that has dried with the brush, trying to pick it back up off of the paper. But this cobalt blue is not budging. So in this case, I end up trying a few more times to blot it back up, to pick it back up with the paper towel, but it doesn't really make a difference. So I'm using that little bit of the white paint, the white gouache, and you should wait until it's completely dry if you try to pick it back up with water and a paper towel. And then once it's completely dry, paint over it with the white gouache, and then give it a second coat once that first coat of gouache is dry. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've had a lot of fun painting this lake sunrise. I hope that you get a chance to create and give it a try, and I'll see you next time.